Alright, let us talk about something that has been on my mind for a hot minute, being a woman in a male dom. Innate work culture. It's like stepping into a boys' club where the rules are unwritten, and honestly, it can be pretty exhausting. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are tons of amazing men out there who support women in the workplace. But let us not pretend that misogyny and sexism aren't still lurking around, like unwanted guests at a party. So, let me set the scene. I landed my first big job in a tech company straight out of college. I was stoked. I thought I was ready to take on the world, but boy, was I in for a reality check. The moment I walked into that office, it was like I had entered a different universe. The majority of my colleagues were men. I quickly realized that I was one of the few women in the room. It felt like I was walking into a locker room where I didn't belong. At first, I tried to fit in, laugh at their jokes even when they were cringeworthy. I mean, who wants to be the buzzkill, right? But then I started noticing the little things like how my ideas were often overlooked in meetings. I pitched something and it would get brushed off, only for a guy to say the same thing 5 minutes later and get all the credit. It was infuriating. I felt like I was shouting into a void and nobody was listening. There was this one meeting where I finally had enough. I had worked hard on this project and was super excited to share my ideas. I presented my thoughts and you could practically hear crickets in the room. A couple of guys nodded, but it felt like I was talking to a wall. Then just as I was about to wrap it up, one of the guys jumped in and repeated what I said, but with a little more confidence. And guess what? Everyone suddenly thought it was the best idea ever. I wanted to scream. It was such a classic case of the man said it, so it must be brilliant. I started to realize that this wasn't just about me. It was about a culture that undervalues women's contributions. It is like we were constantly fighting for a seat at the table, while dealing with the underlying sexism that just one quit. I've had colleagues assume I was in a support role when I was actually leading the project. The casual misogyny is real, and it can be pretty disheartening. But here's the thing, I decided I wasn't going to let that stop me. I started to think strategically about how to navigate this environment. Figured if I couldn't change their minds, I could at least change my approach. I began to leverage my strengths as a woman in a male-dominated space. I started connecting with other women in the industry, and let me tell you, it was a game changer. We shared our experiences, our struggles, and our strategies for dealing with the nonsense. It felt empowering to know I wasn't alone in this fight. One thing I learned was the importance of building a support network. I reached out to other women in my company and even sought out mentors who understood the challenges I was facing. Those relationships were invaluable. They provided me with guidance and encouragement, and they reminded me that I had a voice worth listening to. I realized that we could lift each other up and create a community that countered the toxic culture we were navigating. I also started to embrace my uniqueness. Let's be real, being a woman in a male-dominated field gives me a different perspective. I began to use that to my advantage. I'd approach problems from angles that my male colleagues might not consider. I brought empathy and collaboration to the table, which helped foster a more inclusive environment. Slowly but surely, I started to gain respect for my contributions. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still days when the sexism was hard to ignore. Once had a colleague tell me that I was too emotional during a discussion. Like, excuse me, just because I was passionate about my work doesn't mean I'm emotional. It was frustrating to see how easily my enthusiasm was dismissed. But instead of letting it get to me, I used it as fuel. I made it a point to stay calm and collected, showing them that I could handle my business without losing my cool. I also learned the power of assertiveness. I started speaking up more in meetings. I made sure to follow up on my ideas if someone else took credit for something I said. I wouldn't hesitate to say, hey, I mentioned that earlier. It felt a bit scary at first, but I realized that if I didn't advocate for myself, no one else would. And you know what? It worked. People started to take notice, and I could see the shift in how they treated me. Another tactic I picked up was to document my achievements. I started keeping a record of my contributions and successes, whether it was completing a project ahead of schedule or receiving positive feedback from clients. This way, when it came time for performance reviews, I had tangible proof of my value. It's amazing how many people overlook their accomplishments. But I learned that you have to own your success and make sure others see it too. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the misogyny. It's real and it's exhausting. I've had to deal with comments about my appearance, assumptions about my capabilities, and even outright disrespect. But instead of letting it bring me down, I've learned to call it out when I see it. I've had conversations with my male colleagues about their language and attitudes, and while it's uncomfortable, it's necessary. We need to hold each other accountable, and sometimes that means having those tough conversations. And here's the kicker: I've found that many men are open to learning. They just might not realize the impact of their words or actions. I've had dialogues with guys who genuinely wanted to understand how to be better allies. It's all about creating a culture of awareness and respect, and that starts with open communication. At the end of the day, being a woman in a male-dominated work culture can be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. We have the chance to break down barriers, change the narrative, and create a more inclusive environment for everyone. It's not easy, but if we support each other and stand our ground, we can make a difference. So, to all the women out there navigating this landscape, remember, you have a voice and it matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Use your strengths, build your network, and don't be afraid